Tonight, we're not just looking back at history, we're stepping right inside it. Picture this. It's the 1700s. Outside, snow piles high against the windows, the wind slicing through the night like a knife. Inside a crooked wooden cottage, a family huddles together in the dark. For them, winter isn't beautiful, it's brutal. A fight for survival, night after night. Before we step into their world, get yourself ready. Pull up a blanket, pour something warm, and listen closely. This isn't just a story, it's an experience of survival, sacrifice, and the sheer resilience of the human spirit. But before we begin, do me one favor. Hit that like button if you're ready to time travel with me tonight. Subscribe so you don't miss our future journeys into the forgotten corners of history. And let's make this interactive. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Maybe you're up late in the US, just starting your morning in Europe, or tuning in from halfway across the world. Let's see how far this community stretches tonight, because what's about to unfold is a story you won't want to miss. The first true breath of winter came long before the snows laid their full weight upon the valley. It came as a silence that settled between the trees, a stillness in the marsh where frogs no longer sang, and a tightening in the joints of those who worked the land. In a low cottage of timber frame and wattle daub, its plaster split like old knuckles and its thatch sagging under the memory of past storms, a family listened to that silence and understood it for what it was, the summons to endure. The wind that afternoon carried the dry smell of frozen earth, and the smoke from their hearth hugged the ground instead of rising, as though the sky itself had stiffened and would no longer lift their offerings. It was a year in the early 1700s, though for them time was tallied less by calendars than by the sequence of frosts, thaws, and the rationing of flame. Jakob stood outside with his palm pressed to the north wall, feeling where the chill entered, where the clay had fallen away, leaving ribs of stick that rattled when the gusts struck true. His breath came white and slow. Inside, Elin sorted a tangle of wool scraps. The first true breath of winter came long before the snows laid their full weight upon the valley. It came as a silence that settled between the trees, a stillness in the marsh where frogs no longer sang, and a tightening in the joints of those who worked the land. In a low cottage of timber frame and wattle daub, its plaster split like old knuckles and its thatch sagging under the memory of past storms, a family listened to that silence and understood it for what it was, the summons to endure. The wind that afternoon carried the dry smell of frozen earth, and the smoke from their hearth hugged the ground instead of rising, as though the sky itself had stiffened and would no longer lift their offerings. Jakob stood outside with his palm pressed to the north wall, feeling where the chill entered, where the clay had fallen away, leaving ribs of stick that rattled when the gusts struck true. His breath came white and slow. Inside, Elin sorted a tangle of wool scraps, turning them, aligning edges, judging by finger whether any thickness remained worth a patch. On the pallet near the hearth, the children, Thomas and little Marta, played at stacking splinters like miniature logs, imitating the movements they had seen 100 times: selection, placement, blowing gentle life into a reluctant ember. Over them, the grandmother, called only More by everyone, watched with half-lidded eyes, storing her strength as squirrels store hazelnuts in hollow stumps. Beyond their door, the forested ridge had been stripped by generations who never had enough fuel for a winter, only enough for a set of nights. The great beaches of Moore's childhood were stories now. What remained was spindly birch, stubborn alder, tangles of hazel, and the occasional oak trunk too twisted to split easily. The river, not yet frozen, whispered low beneath a skim of frail ice, and thin reeds shuddered like a congregation kneeling to invisible instruction. Tracks of a fox stitched the mud, already whitening at the edges where frost rehearsed its coming dominion. Jakob re-entered, stamping his boots free of crumbly soil. The smell of old leather, damp wool, and hearth smoke formed a tapestry of the season. He did not speak his worry. Words made fear solid. Instead, he lifted the warped wooden chest lid and removed the small bundle of kindling saved from late summer. Straight twigs dried beneath the eaves on a week of rare sunlight. He turned them in his hands the way a merchant might turn a coin of questionable metal, precious, limited, unrepeatable until the earth cycled again. "We will pack the wall after supper," Elin said, not looking up. Her fingers never stopped teasing threads apart from the still usable cloth. Her tone made the statement an ordinance, not merely a plan. She paused only to blow a strand of hair from her cheek before knotting two irregular scraps together in a manner more clever than neat. The colours, browns, dull greens, a faded blue that must once have been bright, mixed into a map of desperation and making do. More shifted and cleared her throat with a sound like a boot scraping on gravel. The cold sits early. Wolf winter, maybe. Her eyes moved to the fire where the low coals glowed with a sullen authority. Above them a pot of thin barley and root shavings quivered just short of simmering. Best teach the girl the embers proper before the deep weeks. Marta's head lifted, stray curls catching orange light. She was small for her 6 winters, quicker to notice a draught than a compliment, and already she understood that within the logic of survival, competence was its own form of affection. Thomas, 2 winters older, pretended indifference yet leaned nearer, listening for instruction that would soon become his to give. When the pale sun folded itself behind the ridge, the temperature inside the cottage slipped perceptibly. The air tasted sharper, as if the invisible crystals forming outside invited the lungs to participate. Supper was ladled, a ladle that scraped the pot to be sure of every grain, and eaten in slow, ceremonial silence except for the soft tapping of wooden spoons against rough bowls. After, they set to their wall. Jakob mixed clay with handfuls of straw near the doorway, the damp earth crumbling between his fingers before his palm coaxed it into a cohesive mass. The frost inside the wall's cracks had outlined every failure of last year's repairs. Elin passed him bundles of moss saved from autumn's final gathering, a velvety insulation harvested with care from fallen logs on days when the children pretended moss was ocean foam. Now it became Morta's companion, Thomas entrusted with stuffing rags into the widest gaps while the new daub cured, took each torn scrap like a junior steward and pressed it in with a firmness that bespoke practice. Marta watched, the intensity of her gaze magnified by the hearthlight. Moore beckoned her and held out a char-blackened stick. "You trace the wall where the draughts run." The old woman guided the child's small hand, encouraging her to feel, not just see, the breathed promise of coming chill. "Where the flame flutters," she nodded toward a sliver of candle flicker placed near a suspect's seam. "There you mark. Tomorrow we reckon what still leaks." So the night lengthened. Outside, the first soft dry specks of snow began to drift. Not enough yet to cloak, only enough to suggest intention. Inside, the pace of tasks slowed. The mending folded away, the clay bowl sealed with a cloth, The last conscious energy in the room centered on the control of the fire. Elin knelt, arranges a modest architecture, 2 thicker sticks forming a narrow V, a stick of resinous pine, found weeks prior near a stump, shaved to curls and nestled between them, a scattering of last summer's dried seed heads, and atop all this a single promise of flame from yesterday's coal coaxed to incandescence by a practised breath. "The fire is like a living creature," Moore murmured. "You feed it small when it is small, moderate when it is strong, and deny it extravagance when it hungers greedily, else tomorrow you starve." Marta repeated the cadence under her breath, committing it the way some children commit prayers. Thomas, already half drowsy, pulled the patched wool over his knees and watched the heat's glimmer dance on his knuckles. When they finally lay down, they did so layered, linen thinned by years, wool smelling faintly of lanolin, outer garments repurposed as blankets. The bed frame creaked under redistributed weight. Grandmother at one edge, children between, parents forming the final barrier against drafts that explored each imperfection, like burglars seeking a latch. Somewhere in the thatch, a mouse travelled its habitual run, rustling dry reed like tiny paper flags. The faint warmth pooling beneath the shared coverings was less a comfort than a strategic resource, but it held. Through the dark hours, Jakob woke thrice. Each time he lifted the ash carefully with the iron spoon to discover glowing hearts still pulsing. He buried them again, satisfied. On his final waking, he heard the subtle new hush that follows a deepening snowfall, the world muffled as if breathing through a thick cloth. He slept then, first fully restful sleep since the soil hardened. Morning announced itself not with brightness, but with a dim, sourceless light reflecting from a landscape now transformed. Snow lay in a shallow sheet, accenting every rut and mound, softening the ragged edge where the cottage's foundation met earth. The smoke from their morning rekindling rose straighter, the air above fractionally steadier in its cold. Inside, their breaths formed little transient veils until the hearth asserted itself. "We must go for wood before the drift deepens," Jakob said, after they chewed the crusts kept wrapped in cloth. He weighed the decision like a scale in his mind. To wait meant a harder walk later. To go now meant leaving Elin and the children in a house still losing the stored night heat. Tomas comes. He needs the track practice. Elin did not object. Necessity brooked little argument. She adjusted Tomas's wool, wrapped a length of worn linen twice about his neck and tied it with a square efficient knot. "You keep to his heel," she told the boy, which in the language of households meant obedience not just to direction, but to the subtle reading of weather, terrain, and the father's unspoken evaluations. Tomas nodded with solemn seriousness, pride warring with the apprehension of cold. They set out along the path that angled first by the frozen cart ruts, then sloped toward the stand of birch where fallen limbs accumulated, each footprint compressed with a faint squeak. The snow, though thin, reflected enough of the morning to make the world seem both exposed and distant. Their hands reddened quickly, fingers flexed to maintain blood. Thomas learned to snatch twigs in bundles rather than singly, to test branches for rot before wasting effort, to gather slender pieces that would blaze early, and a smaller selection of thicker fuel to sustain embers. "Never ignore the grey wood," Jakob said, tapping a branch whose bark had sloughed off. "Dry inside, eager to burn clean. Wet-looking ones waste heat boiling themselves before warming us." Thomas tucked the knowledge beside other winter lore. That north-facing bark holds more moss, that alder smokes harshly, that pine spits if green. They worked in near silence except for the crack of brittle sticks, the coarse exhalation after bending against stiff trunks, and once the far, thin howl of a wolf carried on air sharpened by distance. Both paused, listening. The sound belonged more to the conceptual fear of winter than present risk. Still it accelerated their motions. By late morning their rope bundle bulged with scavenged lengths. Not enough for a store, such luxury seemed mythical, but enough to stretch the current rhythm of consumption by another set of meals. On return, Tomas's arms trembled from gripping. Elin met them, relief flickering across her face so swiftly it might have been a shadow. She did not praise. She redistributed wood to interior, exterior sheltered, and drying positions with decisiveness. Praise was implied by efficient use. That afternoon snow thickened, tilting not straight down but in a slow swirl that found every seam in clothing. The cottage dimmed, though it was not yet evening, and tasks shifted to indoor economies, carding a little coarse wool while reciting quiet arithmetic of remaining grain, sorting the good rags from those now only suitable for stuffing, teaching Marta the beginning of a stitch that bound edges without fray. Each small act stitched the family into a fabric thicker than the raw materials. Days settled into a pattern resilient enough to absorb small shocks. Some mornings brought brittle, clear skies, the light so fierce on crusted drifts that eyes watered. Other mornings delivered new accumulations that remapped the known paths until even the low fence posts looked like hunched figures. Wind visited in personalities, the bored, low exhalation that seeped under the door, the impatient tapping that rattled the half-hinged shutter, the furious, sustained push that made the thatch fibres hum. With each variation the family recalibrated. On still days, Elin aired the bedding briefly, a luxury measured in heartbeats, to chase dampness that would otherwise breed cough. On cutting days, they conserved movement, layering tasks so every trip across the earthen floor carried multiple purposes. Retrieve a pot, adjust a rag plug, soothe a fretful child with a soft word that doubled as instruction. Midwinter announced its dominion not with a date but with the first morning their stored potatoes, few and small, exhaled a sweet rot when cut. Elin trimmed the salvageable halves, boiled them with the last carrot, and thickened the thinness with ground barley scraped from the barrel's lower curve. Moore ate slowly, eyes turned inward to memory. "Your father once traded a carved spoon for a sack of peat," she said to no one in particular. "Burned slow, it did. Smelled like a bog breathing." The story, like peat, released its heat gradually, warming them by association with a winter survived before this one. Sickness visited as lightly as could be hoped. A week of Thomas's nose running and a cough that rattled only at dusk, managed by Elin's onion syrup and the stern command not to let the chill settle in his chest. Marta's cheeks chapped raw, until Elin smeared them with tallow saved from the autumn slaughter of a neighbour's hog. In exchange for 2 days Jacob spent mending a sled runner. Such exchanges mapped a network of survival, debts tracked not on paper, but in recollection of who had warmth to spare when another did not. One evening a knock came, 3 hesitant raps spaced with the timing of someone unaccustomed to asking. Jacob opened to find Oscar, a widower from a farther plot, his beard rimed with frost. He held, cradled like an infant, a coal wrapped in folded birch bark. "Went out," Oscar said simply, his voice hollow with the echo of a cold room. The phrase held whole narratives, a draught, a sputter of damp fuel, A moment's inattention while he stepped outside to relieve himself, a returning to ash that could not be persuaded back to life. Elin was already at the hearth, coaxing their low bank to seed a living ember. She lifted it with tongs, set it gently into Oscar's prepared nest. No one spoke of return obligations. The debt would surface at some tense future moment when they would be the ones knocking. Nights lengthened further, then imperceptibly began shortening, though their bodies did not trust the change at first. The cold, paradoxically, deepened while the sun's arc inched higher, a cruel reversal that pressed their morale. It was in these late hard weeks that sleep became crowded with anxious dreams, the fire collapsing to black stone, the roof sagging under a weight they could hear but not avert, a child wandering past the drift line. Morning's first breath of real air dispelled most of these phantoms, but their residue made Jakob double-check structural sounds, and Elin recount the kindling twice. On a day of merciless clarity, when every sound cracked like an icicle breaking, Jakob brought in an armful of wood and paused. Eyes narrowed. "Hear that?" The others stilled. It came faint but distinct, the muted rush of water shifting under new pressure. The river, locked for weeks, was adjusting to a subtle thaw upstream. Hope, that most dangerous fuel, edged into the room. Moore clicked her tongue. "Not yet," she warned. "The thaw that teases steals more lives than the first freeze." They banked the coals carefully that night, refusing indulgence to the seduction of imagined warmth. Still, change had initiated its procession whether they consented or not. Sunlight lingered a breath longer against the cottage's east wall before surrendering to dusk. A crow called from a bare branch, voice rough, but undeniably alive, and Marta laughed at the sound as if it were a story told just for her. Thomas found a length of willow softened enough to bend without snapping. He worked it in his hands while seated near the hearth, imagining a future season when such suppleness would mean baskets, not mere fidgeting relief. The rhythm of rationing fire remained precise. Elin taught Marta to lay a morning rekindling. Scrape aside ash with the spoon, never scatter it, ash is a blanket. Expose 2 glowing embers, never more, waste. Feed them with a shaved sliver placed crosswise to encourage quick catch. Breathe from the side, never from above lest you cool them with the wrong angle of air. Each instruction delineated a boundary between persistence and loss. Marta's first successful solo coaxing earned no applause, only the passing of responsibility for alternate mornings. The promotion itself was celebration. When a wet, heavy snow fell, different in its sodden weight and faint smell of distant thaw, they reinforced the thatch with a rope pulled taut over the ridge and anchored to rocks near the foundation. Jakob climbed a ladder whose rungs creaked, swept broad arcs with a birch broom to shed accumulation before it soaked and froze into a crust that would require back-breaking hacking later. From below, Elin monitored the wall for drips, fingers ready to mark new infiltration points. Maintenance, vigilance, adaptation. These were the liturgies of winter. During a particularly wind-torn night, a shutter tore loose, banging until the hinge threatened to split. Jakob, teeth clenched against the cold knifing through the opening, held it while Thomas fetched the iron spike reserved for such emergencies. Together they re-pinned it at a slightly skewed angle. The gap along its edge now admitted a thin seam of starlight, but the structure held. "A house is never finished," Jakob muttered, more philosophy than complaint. Elin, stuffing wool into the new seam, nodded without lifting her gaze, and all the while their internal narrative stretched. a continuous thread linking each act, splitting a stick along its grain to dry faster near the hearth, rotating damp boots by quarter turns, turning a fraying hem so the weaker warp threads took less strain. These acts were not separate tasks. They were chapters in a story of refusal. Refusal to yield to indifferent cold, to hunger's erosion, to the slow abrasion of monotony. The hunger did sharpen, though. The barrel of grain's bottom curved upward like a moon rising, and the wooden scoop rasped louder against it. Elin thickened pottage with shredded dried nettle leaves saved from high summer. The green flecks tasted faintly of iron and memory. Marta made a face at first mouthful, then saw Elin watching and spooned it dutifully with a neutral expression that matured her another fraction of a season. In the deepest quiet of one night, long after even the mice had retired from their rustlings, Marta woke to a cold nose pressing her wrist. The neighbour's small dog, temporarily boarded while its owner mended a collapsed outbuilding, had nosed its way under the blanket seeking a warmer core. Marta hesitated, then curled her body instinctively around its compact heat. By morning she would not remember the decision, only that she had slept without the usual shivers. Later, Elin would note fewer coughs with the dog sharing nights, a data point stored for future winters. Every creature's warmth was a negotiable asset, so the first section of winter's long campaign resolved into a sustained defence line, bent in places, patched often, but intact. Outside, the valley whitened and re-whitened as wind redistributed old snow into new drifts. Inside, the family's routines condensed into a craft honed by necessity. Their story moved forward not in grand events, but in the accrual of proficient gestures. Survival, they were learning again as every generation had, was an artistry of increments, none sufficient alone, all indispensable together. Yet artistry, no matter how disciplined, could not conjure what the land withheld. The mid-span of the cold season brought with it a test of scarcity that pressed not only muscle and bone, but judgment. On a morning edged with a metallic glare, Jakob lifted the lid of their smallest chest and stared at the diminishing twist of flax fibres they used for wicks. The existing lamp wick, charred halfway, would last a few more evenings if trimmed carefully. They had grown accustomed to moving by hearthlight and memory, yet some tasks, splinter removal from a child's palm, checking for mould blossoming at the base of the wall behind a hanging blanket, demanded directed light. He replaced the lid, stored the observation among the private ledger of calculations he navigated daily. Elin, meanwhile, assessed the remaining soap, a puck misshapen by repeated soakings and dryings. Washing of hands after tending animals, a neighbour's loaned goat needed milking when its owner took a fever, had already been reduced to sand scrubbing and cold rinses. To stretch the soap further risked illness. To consume it now risked running empty when sickness inevitably attempted its entry. Every object, once background, had become a node in a network of trade-offs. Thomas began to ask more questions, his mind hungry for frameworks. "Why don't we gather all the wood before the snow?" he asked while splitting a thin billet under Jakob's supervision. The axe blade, recently honed with a stone carried warm inside Jakob's coat before use, parted the grain with a clean crack. "Because every other family thinks the same," Jakob said. "And because our backs bend only so many hours in warm months before the work of planting, mending fences, repairing roof, cutting flax, and tending the small patch we call ours demands those hours. The land gives us enough tasks to fill 10 lives stacked. We bargain with time and energy the way we bargain with sticks now." Marta listened, face intent. She had begun sleeping with her hands curled under her arms to keep fingers warmer. Elin noticed, added an extra wrapping of an old linen band around her wrists at night to reduce heat loss. Such acts, small seam reinforcements in the fabric of their survival, formed a quiet language of care. The wind shifted to the east for 3 days, bringing with it a dryness that split lips and shrank wood so that gaps widened audibly with soft pops in the night. On the 3rd evening, a deep report sounded from somewhere outside, a resonant crack like a tree's complaint under sudden load. Jakob stood immediately listening. The sound came again, followed by a drawn-out settling groan. "Elm down on the ridge, likely," he said. Elin's eyes met his. An entire conversation travelled between them. Green elm would be wet, heavy to haul, slow to season. Still, portions could be split and dried near the hearth, rotated often, granting next month's embers longevity. The risk, exposure hauling in cold that punished sweat. They waited until dawn's first grey, then Jakob and Thomas went to locate the fallen. The elm had split along a seam of old storm injury, its upper half sprawled across brush like a felled giant. Jakob laid a palm against its core. "Cold all through," he said. "We take the limbs small enough to dry against our wall." They worked methodically, axes biting, each impact sending vibrations up stiff arms. Thomas learned to roll his shoulder loosely between swings to conserve strength, breath plumed with each effort. After an hour, Jakob saw the boy's aim wandering dangerously. "Stop," he said quietly, setting his own axe down. "Fatigue dulls judgment before muscle. We carry what we have." They bound the cut lengths with rope, dragging rather than lifting when possible. Back at the cottage, Elin cleared a new drying space near the interior wall, where reflective heat pulsed most consistently. She stacked the elm lengths with gaps for air and set a rotation schedule in her mind. The rhythm of future days adjusted minutely around this addition. That afternoon, Moore told a story, unbidden, which marked its importance. "Year of the ash blight," she began, eyes on a knot in the wall as if it framed the memory. "No good ash left for handles. Men borrowed tools and broke them. Tempers broke after. Fire that year was mostly straw twist and dung. Smoke so thick you wore it like a second skin. But we catalogued every trick to make embers last. You," she indicated Elin, "were not yet born. Your mother, God rest her, kept flame alive through a 3-day storm when we could not open the door. Never wasted a breath blowing. Cupped her hands, made a wind tunnel. That's why these children breathe heat now." The story draped over them, a reminder that their present strategies descended from generational experimentation, a lineage of iterative design under duress. Evenings stretched. Without ample lamplight, conversation compressed to the essential. Yet silence did not imply emptiness. It carried the sound of the fire's minute adjustments, the soft hiss when residual sap met flame, the muffled shifting of the straw mattress, the whimper of dreams turned uneasy by cold. Marta sometimes traced shapes in the thin layer of soot near the hearthstones. Elin would wipe them away each morning to prevent build-up, using a damp cloth wrung almost dry to save liquid water. Water itself became labour-intensive. The river, thickly iced now, required daily chiselling at a hole maintained by rotational duty. Jakob used an iron spike, striking rhythmically until a plug of ice lifted. He skimmed out floating shards with a wooden ladle, careful not to wet gloves that would freeze stiff. The water, metallic with cold, was hauled in 2 small buckets, Large ones risked spilling precious weight if a slip occurred. Inside, the surface crusted overnight even near the hearth if not stirred. Marta's new chore: tap the surface at dawn to prevent a thicker freeze. Her execution pleased Elin. She did it with quiet pride. Illness struck the widower Oscar harder than a mere fever. One night, a frantic rapping came, irregular and weak. Jakob opened to find a neighbour's adolescent daughter supporting Oscar at the threshold, his face sunken. "He won't keep water," the girl said. Without lengthy discussion, Elin cleared the warmest corner, near enough to the hearth's side heat yet away from draughts. Oscar, lowered onto blankets, shivered violently despite their relative warmth. His breath rattled like paper shaken. Dehydration threatened faster in cold where thirst signals dulled. Elin prepared a thin infusion. Dried yarrow and a pinch of willow bark steeped in water just off boil to preserve volatile properties. She cooled it by pouring between vessels, then lifted Oscar's head and dribbled small amounts past cracked lips. He coughed, some spilling, but enough went down. Through the night she and Moore rotated watch, checking his pulse with fingers placed lightly at neck, adjusting his coverings to wick sweat when his temperature spiked. Marta woke once and observed silently from her bed space, absorbing the lesson that survival included stewardship beyond one's immediate blood. Oscar's fever broke on the fourth dawn. He slept then with an exhaustion deeper than mere rest. When he finally sat upright unassisted, he wept, a quiet leaking from eyes accustomed to stoicism. "Debt," he said hoarsely. Jakob shook his head minutely. "Future would run," he replied. Agreement codified. When Oscar left 2 days later, he took with him a wrapped ember in a clay pot kept for that purpose alone. They watched until his figure blurred with the grey distance. Food calculations grew more intricate. Elin began thinning pottage with snow melted and simmered to reduce any pathogens invisible. The taste diluted, yet the volume soothed bellies for a time. She reserved the denser fraction at the pot's bottom for the children under the guise of scraping duty. They accepted it as chore reward, unaware of the algebra balancing fairness, growth needs, and morale. Thomas, driven by a restlessness that idle hours sharpen, fashioned a crude snare from a length of willow and a loop of preserved gut. Jakob approved the craft silently, then took him to a sheltered brush line where hairprints dotted the snow like a coded message. "Set it along a run, not at a burrow mouth," he instructed, "and mark it subtle for us to find, but not so obvious another eye reads it." Thomas placed the snare with meticulous care. For days it caught nothing. Each empty check taught patience. On the 6th morning, they found the loop tightened, the snow disturbed in a flurry of last struggle. A small hare lay still, its heat long fled. Thomas stood motionless, a mixture of triumph, sadness, and gratitude rippling across his face. "We speak thanks," Jakob said simply. Thomas bowed his head and murmured a quiet acknowledgement to a life converted to theirs. The hare stretched meals, meat boiled, bones cracked to release marrow, hide scraped and salted with a pinch of precious crystals saved for preserving. The hide, though small, would later line a mitten or patch a slipper. Nothing existed as single purpose now. One brittle night, the temperature dropped so severe the thatch frost blossomed into crystalline ferns, visible even by low firelight. Elin woke with a start, breath catching at the beauty and the threat intertwined. She reached instinctively to feel Marta's feet, cool but not dangerously so, and pulled the children closer between her and Jakob. Heat, in these hours, flowed like currency among their bodies, a redistribution without ledger. The psychological weight of monotony began its own assault. Days so similar they risked blending, blurring the sense of forward movement needed to fuel persistence. To counter, Elin introduced small variations, a lesson in knotting cord more efficiently, a game of identifying wood species by smell alone when warmed at the fire, a recitation of place names from Moore's remembered youth, many now changed or vanished. These exercises cost nothing material yet returned engagement, orienting minds to progression. Moore's hands, knuckles swollen from decades of labour, began to ache more sharply. Cold drove pain inward like wedges. Elin warmed smooth stones near the fire, then wrapped them in cloth and placed them against Moore's fingers. Marta watched, then imitated with the smaller pebble for her own hands, declaring herself, practicing keeping future aches away. They laughed softly, the sound thin but genuine. Another visitor came, a gaunt man from farther south driving a pair of underfed sheep ahead of him. He asked with brittle politeness for direction to a family rumoured to trade wool for labour. Jacob provided the route. The man eyed their wood stack with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Hard winter," he said. "They all are," Jacob replied evenly. The exchange ended. After the man left, Thomas asked, "Why not offer him food?" Jacob answered after a long pause, "Because we have measured what we have against our number. Because a wrong gift now could empty a bowl later when fever strikes us. Because kindness must be rationed like everything else, or it becomes a leak that sinks the vessel. And because when we can offer without risking you or your sister, we will." Thomas nodded reluctantly. The lesson carved a stern groove in his growing ethics. Storm followed that encounter, a dense, windless fall that buried their outer woodpile so thoroughly Jacob had to probe with a stick to locate the top layer. They expended more fuel than planned that stretch, just to dry gloves and socks that dampened from repeated digging. Elin adjusted by further lowering the evening flame earlier, extending ember management into hours normally allowed a low flicker. They sat more in darkness then, relying on touch to pass bowls, counting zip-ops in the settling wood to measure time. Out of that heavy snow came an unexpected abundance. A section of a neighbour's old fencing collapsed under weight, and with communal consent they divided the weathered rails for burning. The wood, having endured seasons already, burned quick and hot, useful for boiling water or searing a thicker porridge at week's end. Elin used one such burst to bake a flat oat cake pressed thin on a heated stone. The crisp edges felt almost like festival to the children. Celebration, they learned, could be engineered from timing as much as ingredients. As the second half of the cold season deepened, subtle external signs hinted at approaching transition. Sun angles shifted enough that a narrow beam briefly pierced a crack near the door at mid-morning, illuminating motes in a golden column. A raven pair began frequent low passes, their wing beats audibly displacing brittle air. Ice near the river hole thinned unpredictably, its upper layer cloudy instead of glass clear. Each observation Elin logged silently, weaving them into a forecast refined by years. Still, caution reigned. The false thaws of past winters had punished premature optimism with refreezes that cracked water casks and chilled lungs unguarded by earlier habits. Jacob reminded Thomas point by point, "We do not reduce layers because of one warm noon. We do not waste dry wood making a large blaze because spring is near. We do not let embers die one night thinking tomorrow will be gentle. The cold loves arrogance. Thomas repeated these, a litany against complacency. One morning, while skimming ice, Jakob misjudged a step on a slick-angled rock. His foot slid, twisting his knee sharply. Pain flared. He caught himself with the spike, breath hissing. He tested weight, functional but weakened. Back inside, Elin bound the joint with the strip of linen and wrapped over it with a narrow wool band to stabilize without cutting circulation. "You reduce wood trips," she said. He did not argue. Thomas inherited more hauling, his posture straightening perceptibly with the accession of responsibility. To compensate for Jakob's reduced range, Elin authorized burning a small reserve of particularly dry birch she had been saving for a worst-case sickness scenario. The decision reflected the dynamic nature of their planning. Risk models updated with each injury, each visitor, each weather shift. Survival required governance, adaptive management of assets, roles, and contingencies. They were, in effect, a small institution run on tacit constitutions enforced by mutual recognition of stakes. Moore's cough deepened into her chest one week. She sat propped to ease breathing, eyes glistening in the firelight's intermittent pulses. Elin brewed a decoction of pine needles and spruce tips, vitamin-laden bitterness cutting the taste fatigue. She sweetened it faintly with a smear of honey preserved in a clay jar, an indulgence deferred until medical utility warranted its unlocking. Moore sipped, face tightening, then nodding. "Your measures are sound," she whispered. The acknowledgement carried immense weight. Validation in crisis reinforced Elin's morale. During Moore's convalescence, Marta assumed her grandmother's role of fire watcher at dusk. Elin hovered the first evenings, then gradually withdrew as Marta demonstrated consistent judgment. Limiting her feedings to thumb-thick sticks, rotating their orientation to maintain a triangular arrangement that encouraged even oxygen flow, banking ash deliberately to one side to preserve a future morning's quick catch. Thomas, envious, threw himself into perfecting snare placements. Specialization emerged. Early evidence of a division of labor optimizing household efficiency under constraint. Moore improved slowly, though her stamina receded. She narrated less, conserving breath, and when she did speak it was condensed, each sentence purposeful. "Do not sit fully idle even when strength thins," she told Marta. "Idle mind invites dread to roost." To illustrate, she had the girl practice counting heartbeats between drips from a small thawing icicle brought inside. A mindfulness exercise disguised as play. The elm limbs taken earlier now gave forth better heat after weeks of drying near radiant surfaces. They burned with a steady, modest flame, predictable, which itself was a resource. Predictability reduced cognitive load, freeing attention for other adjustments. Jakob, leg improved but not fully trustworthy, timed his movements to coincide with these stable burns to minimize unpredictability stacking. One late afternoon, clouds thickened low and uniform, pressing the world into a prematurely shadowed chamber. A sound began, faint at first, then insistent. A soft susurration like sand poured steadily. Ice pellets, not snow, striking the thatch and frozen ground. The pellets accumulated as a brittle crust, coating every surface in a glassy shell. Walking on it risked slips. Walking after it refroze risked cutting footwear already thinned. Travel halted. They pivoted to indoor tasks exclusively for the span. Elin used the enforced seclusion to audit clothing, turning garments inside out, inspecting seams, reinforcing weak spots with whip stitches. Preventive maintenance forestalled catastrophic failure at an inopportune moment. Trapped indoors more hours than usual, tension risked rising. Thomas grew sharp in tone. Marta responded with sulk. Elin intervened indirectly. She set them a joint project. Braid a new length of cord from unravelling flax threads, too short for weaving. Cooperation required synchronization of rhythm, attention to twist direction, negotiation over tension. The task absorbed their frictions, converting latent conflict energy into a durable tool. When finished, the cord hung coiled near the door, a physical testament to redirected emotion. Jacob spent part of that ice-locked day carving a small notch tally on the interior post, 1 mark for each week fully endured. The marks did not represent days, too many demoralizing, but clusters of effort already proven survivable. He did not tally ahead. Uncarved wood stood as potential, not obligation. Late that night, after the ice shifted to fine powdery snow, a distant glow coloured the low clouds to the north, a diffuse orange smear. "Fire?" Thomas whispered. Jakob stepped outside briefly, returning with cheeks burning red. "Likely the big farmer's haystack caught," he said. Loss elsewhere carried complicated feelings, empathy tempered by the selfish relief that the misfortune did not reside here. Elin banked the fire lower, an instinctive gesture of conservation in response to external disaster. The next day brought news via a passing youth. The hay loss was partial, contained by community bucket chain despite frozen fingers and sloshed water turning to glass on sleeves. The event served as cautionary tale retold through the day. Chimneys poorly swept, embers popped into dry straw. Marta listened, eyes wide, reinforcing her understanding of why Elin insisted on clearing stray ash daily. Safety protocols, internalized through narrative, required less enforcement by nagging, so the middle passage of winter churned forward, layered with micro-adaptations. By now, each family member embodied a distinct portfolio of skills and responsibilities. Their collective resilience had compounded, capital built not from coin but from practiced coordination, mutual trust, and a shared, evolving mental model of risk management. And yet, the season still held them firmly. Release, when it came, would not be a dramatic unfurling but a reluctant stepwise concession by cold. Signs of that concession began almost imperceptibly. First, a drop sounded from the eaves at noon, one clear, resonant drip that paused the entire room. Marta's head lifted. "Water," she breathed. They waited. Another drip, then silence. False beginnings were common. They schooled themselves to note without extrapolating a future not yet earned. Days later, a more sustained midday thaw softened the upper crust of snow, making afternoon travel a wet slog and evening surfaces refreeze into treacherous glass. Jakob adjusted wood gathering to early morning exclusively, when the snow still bore weight. Efficiency windows narrowed and required precision timing. Thomas learned to read the snow's microtextures, granular sparkle indicating firmer crust, dull matte signalling hidden slush. These observational literacies would remain with him long after this winter dissolved. Food stores approached nadir. One evening Elin opened the grain barrel and for the first time her fingers touched unvarnished wood across most of the bottom. She measured the remaining handful and divided it into 4 equal mounds on the table. Each mound she then split further, half into a cloth to mill fine for an easily digestible porridge for more, the other half to be coarsely ground for a more filling, slower-eaten mixture for the rest. Redistribution optimized nutritive impact across age and need. 3 more weeks at this measure, she calculated inwardly, assuming no supplement. Supplement became priority. The snares yielded a second hare, and then nothing for a span. Animal movement patterns had shifted with changing snow conditions. Jakob, knee stronger, expanded their trapline subtly, without overextending fuel reserves for the extra travel. He refused to chase diminishing returns. Restraint preserved energy better than aggressive pursuit beyond capacity. One afternoon Oscar returned, colour in his cheeks again, dragging on a crude sled a bundle of peat sods cut from a bog he knew northward, where frost had receded earlier. "Payment," he said, voice steadier. The peat, dense and dark, promised long, low burns with minimal flame, a perfect overnight bank. Elin accepted with a nod that held layers: gratitude, acknowledgement of restored balance, recognition that such exchanges wove community safety nets through reciprocal obligation rather than charity. That night they incorporated one peat block into the ember bed. Its slow, smouldering combustion extended residual heat beyond previous benchmarks. Marta, waking once before dawn, noted the room less biting and returned to sleep quicker. Sleep quality itself was a resource replenishing their resilience. Moisture seeped incrementally into their world. Wooden tools swelled microscopically. The air lost its knife edge and took on a damp heaviness that carried smell farther, mould beginning in a forgotten rag bin, the rank edge of the dung stack outside. Elin increased ventilation minutes, cracking the door in midday while stirring air near the roof with a palm-fanned cloth to displace moist pockets. Mould suppression now joined cold defence, a new front added without dropping prior vigilance. Moore's strength plateaued below previous winter's baseline. She spoke candidly one night, voice scarcely above the ember's whisper. "There is a chance I do not plant this spring," she said. Silence held afterward, not of denial but of processing. "We will still carry your methods," Elin replied after a beat. Moore exhaled, a faint smile at the edge of her mouth. "Then whether or not I see Thor matters less." The acceptance, framed through continuity of practice, reframed mortality within an intergenerational system's perspective the children half understood viscerally. Of all signs of transition, sound changed most profoundly. The absolute winter hush, sound dampened by powder, internal noises amplified, gave way to trickles, distant snaps of ice sheets fracturing, soft thuds of cornices collapsing from low roofs. The river, still mostly bound, began to murmur in segments, like a voice clearing its throat. Marta knelt by the bank one morning, ear cocked, and giggled at a gurgle that to her seemed the river telling a secret after a vow of silence. Jakob opportunistically felled 2 small dead-standing birch made accessible by snowdrift steps now firm enough to bear weight. Dead-standing wood, drier than green but not as efficient as well-seasoned, formed a strategic bridge fuel between dwindling stores and future supply chains not yet restarted. He cut them into lengths and stacked them loosely under a makeshift lean-to of old planks, angled against the cottage's lee side. A provisional micro-infrastructure project executed with scrap and foresight, Elin undertook inventory consolidation. She inverted sacks to shake out accumulated finds of grain and flour, combining them into a composite meal. She trimmed candle stubs and melted their remnants into a shallow dish, floating a twisted linen thread to form an emergency wick for a future night requiring precise toil, mending a vital strap or extracting a splinter dangerously near a joint. This anticipatory preparation ensured against catastrophic failure triggered by minor untreated injuries. The children, sensing an approaching shift yet constrained still by caution, manifested their anticipation through play that simulated spring, arranging tiny thaw puddles outside into canals with sticks, narrating flows as if engineering irrigation. Their cognitive rehearsal paralleled the adults' practical planning. Both sets of activities forecasted allocation of labour once the thaw fully committed. Temperature swings intensified. Afternoons warmed enough that the cottage interior rose to a relative comfort, inducing lethargy that threatened discipline. Jakob deliberately assigned a mid-afternoon chore rotation, wood review, tool inspection, snare maintenance, to prevent standards from slipping under the narcotic suggestion of ease. He explained to Thomas, early laxness compounds into late scarcity. The boy nodded, internalizing the principle of path dependency, the idea that initial conditions at system transition significantly shaped later outcomes. One evening a migrating flock of geese passed high, their honks muffled but unmistakable. The entire family stepped outside, faces tilted up. The V-pattern wavered in crosswinds, then reformed. "They go north," Marta whispered, awe saturating the observation. Moore stood, leaning on the doorframe, eyes reflecting sky pale. "Measure your tasks," she said quietly. "The ground will open soon and flood you with more demands than you remember." The statement framed coming change not as relief but as shift in burden type. They began pre-thaw staging, repairing the wooden rake teeth with splinters shaved and pegged, oiling the small iron blade with rendered fat to prevent rust bloom when humidity increased, checking seed stores. Few. The true scarcity moved from heat to future food security. Elin sprouted a cloth-wrapped handful of saved peas near the hearth to test viability. Tiny white radicals emerged after days, a silent promise encoded in starch, transformed to life. She adjusted planting projections accordingly. The first day a section of earth appeared, a narrow brown crescent along the south-facing wall where sun reflection magnified warmth. Jakob pressed it between fingers. It clung, plastic but still cold. Not yet. Still, that night sleep came easier. Dream content shifted from anxiety loops to sequences featuring flowing water, green shoots, open doors. Cognitive load redistributed from immediate reactive problem-solving to medium-term planning. Moore took a downturn 2 nights later. Breathing shallowed. Her hands, though warm under blanket layering strategies perfected all season, trembled with minimal exertion. She requested to be propped to see the sliver of revealed earth at dawn. Elin arranged straw and folded blankets to elevate her. The family sat close, not speaking in platitudes but in quiet presence. At first light, pale gold brushed the thaw line. Moore inhaled with audible appreciation. "Enough," she whispered. "You carry it forward." Her eyes closed, breath slowed, then stopped without struggle. Silence settled, distinct from ordinary quiet, a qualitative shift. Elin placed a palm on Moore's forehead, then over her heart, confirming. She covered her face gently with a clean linen square, the one reserved all winter for this possible moment. The children watched, absorbing procedural dignity. Grief registered as a deep internal pressure rather than outward wail. Energy conservation even here shaped expression. Jakob's jaw worked once before stabilizing. Protocol guided them. Body cooled appropriately while they prepared a burial when the ground softened enough to accept a spade. Until then, Moore rested near the coldest interior wall, respectfully separated, sealed from drafts with a draped cloth but within the home's protective boundary, symbol of her continued integration even in death. Elin maintained routine tasks deliberately, modelling resilience continuity. Marta cried that night, quiet tears into her bedding. Elin stroked her hair rhythmically until breathing evened, a regulatory metronome. In subsequent days, references to Moore shifted tense gradually, woven into instruction. Your grandmother would test a draft there with a feather, Elin would say, aligning memory with ongoing praxis. Through such linguistic integration, Moore's experiential capital persisted, mitigating the experiential debt of her absence. The thaw advanced in pulses. Floodwater carved new miniature channels across the yard, rearranging silt into fans that hinted where they might plant later for maximum moisture retention. They mapped these ephemeral flows mentally. Jakob, analysing structural integrity, reinforced the door sill where meltwater sought ingress. He diverted runoff with a shallow trench, employing an economy of effort that leveraged gravity rather than constructing elaborate barriers. Would use patterns inverted. Now sunny afternoons required less burn. Nights still demanded a banked peatwood mix. They reserved birch for damp evenings when rapid drying of interior moisture benefited from a hotter, shorter flame period. System adaptability remained high. They had not allowed winter's rigid routines to fossilize into maladaptive inertia at transition. One morning, Thomas returned from checking snares not with an animal, but with a bundle of emerging willow shoots he had cut carefully. "For basket," he said. Jakob evaluated flexibility, nodded approval. Plans for infrastructure repair, basketry for gathering containment fields, signalled a cognitive shift from pure consumption to asset building, the onset of investment phase following survival phase. This mirrored natural systems where early successional phases yield to growth once disturbance passes. They selected a day, ground half thawed, still resistant at depth, to dig Moore's resting place on a rise beyond the standing alder, where spring floods rarely reached. Soil extraction alternated between spade and iron spike to fracture frost lens. Sweat chilled quickly. They modulated pace to avoid hypothermia. The children gathered small stones to line the base, a drainage measure Moore herself had once instructed for preserving dryness. Ritual and engineering merged. At interment words were few. Jakob spoke a single sentence. "You taught us methods, we will use them." Elin added, "Your warmth extended beyond your hands." Thomas, voice cracking, said, "I will keep embers." Marta placed a small carved stick she had shaped that winter, a crude figure, beside the wrapped form. Layered earth replaced, tamped. A cairn of modest stones, each chosen for stability, rose above, marker, erosion control, memory anchor. After they returned to the cottage, its interior simultaneously emptier and more spacious with grief occupying an acknowledged volume. Elin allowed for one evening a slightly higher flame, symbolic warmth permitted within resource budget as psychological investment. They told a single story of Moore's earlier winter ingenuity, then retired. Resumed discipline the next day closed the ritual's arc. As the landscape transformed, snow withdrawing, retreating into shadowed crevices, the cottage's battle scars became visible. Patches of daub different hues from quick repairs. A shutter hung a fraction lower. A worn path near the woodpile widened by repetitive footfalls. Each imperfection narrated a successful defence. They audited damage systematically, replaster cracks, rethatch a sagging corner before spring rains exploited weakness, reorganize interior storage to rotate items to dry after months near walls where condensation had formed on cold nights. Inventory at winter's end summarized outcomes. Grain nearly exhausted but not empty. Wood reduced to a final stack representing perhaps 4 days at peak burn rate. Clothing patched but serviceable. Tools intact with edges slightly rounded. Resharpening scheduled. Health baseline acceptable aside from residual cough in Tomas and joint ache in Jacob. 1 death integrated. Social ties maintained through debt reciprocation. Peat, ember, future wood run. The ledger, a conceptual artifact balanced with intolerances. They had not overdrawn any single capital to catastrophic depletion. In a gesture of forward pivot, Ellen swept the hearth thoroughly, removing accumulated ash except a thin foundational layer to buffer future thermal shocks. Fresh season's first intentional fire, a small focused blaze not for survival, but for preparing soil-warming stones, felt qualitatively distinct. Purpose expanded beyond immediate maintenance to generative activity. Thomas watched flame shapes with the nuanced gaze not present months earlier. Where once he saw mere heat, he now read burn rate, fuel moisture content, draft behavior, literacies encoded through repetitive winter practice. Marta carried outside a basket, old, frayed, holding the pea sprouts now green-tipped. She knelt by a south-facing patch and pressed fingers into the loosened top inch. "Still cold," she pronounced, voice merging play and analysis. "We wait," she added, echoing the season's primary discipline. That night they lay not in a tight heat-maximizing cluster, but with a bit more spacing, microclimate tolerable for such luxury. Sleep came with fewer abrupt cold-induced wakings. Dreams featured tasks of planting, weaving, mending under sun. Recovery phase initiated. Physiological systems previously stressed into conservation could begin reallocation toward growth. Even grief began to metabolize into motivation, honoring more through the precise application of her taught efficiencies. In the coming weeks they would plant, repair, barter, and begin the slow reaccumulation of stores fated to be spent again when another winter advanced. The cycle did not depress them. It contextualized their efforts within a durable pattern larger than singular hardship. Knowledge had compounded, assets, intangible and material, had persisted or been restored, and each family member's capacity had ratcheted upward, not reverting fully during ease. This incremental ratchet effect would, over successive seasons, mean the difference between fragile subsistence and resilient subsistence. For now, as the last drifts shrank into pitted relics, and the river finally shrugged off its binding crust to run with a voice full and insistent, the family stood outside at dusk. The sky burned in strips of copper and violet. Breath no longer smoked in front of faces. The air smelled of thawed soil, a rich, loamy exhale. Jakob placed an arm lightly around Elin's shoulders, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. Thomas held a small stick of seasoned birch, turning it in his fingers thoughtfully rather than hungrily. Marta traced with the toe the boundary line where snow met earth, narrating an imaginary treaty between seasons. Behind them, the cottage, patched, smoke-blackened, serviceable, rested like a veteran between campaigns. Winter had not been conquered. It never would be. It had been engaged, negotiated with, endured through strategy, restraint, adaptation, and mutual reliance. In that process, the family refined themselves as tools precisely fitted to their environment's demands, and as the first true greens speared through thaw-softened ground days later, they moved toward it with practiced deliberation, carrying forward embers, both literal and remembered, that would seed the hearths of winters yet to come. Mud arrived as an adversary every bit as cunning as snow, silent, adhesive, opportunistic. The hard white maps that had defined their movements dissolved into a brown, shifting terrain that sucked at boots and tried to claim them with each step. Paths vanished beneath a levelling smear. Boundaries blurred. The yard became a slow churn of prints filling with opaque water. Jakob drove small stakes along the most travelled route to the well-hole so the children could balance themselves by fingertip, minimising plunges that drenched socks and stole heat. "We trade cold bite for mire grasp," Elin observed, scraping a cake of soil from the threshold with a flat stick. She placed split planks across the worst sections, makeshift corduroy walkways, salvaged from a collapsed shed wall that a neighbour had given in barter for a morning of Jakob's labour resetting a wobbled door. Thomas took to hammering wedges under the plank edges to keep them from teetering. The work refined his control and focus. Planting could not rush. Thawed surface lied about deeper frost. Jakob cut tests with a narrow spade, first an inch of yielding damp earth, then a resistant layer that rang faintly under metal. "We wait for the frost ghost to release," he said. Waiting taxed them differently than endurance. Patience without the immediate petrifying pressure of cold threatened to erode discipline. Elin maintained a task roster with new headings: sort seed by viability, repair the half-mesh winnowing sieve, unpick thread from rotten garments for reuse, scrub storage jars with hot sand to scour residual oils that might turn rancid. Thomas and Marta helped turn the compost heap: half-decomposed straw, last autumn's leaves, kitchen peelings rendered unrecognisable by winter's quiet work. Steam lifted, faint, carrying a sour earth sweetness. "Life eats what life left," Marta said, pinching her nose and then laughing. Jakob seized the phrase, repeating it as a teaching refrain while they folded partially rotted matter into the upper soil inch of a small bed near the southern exposure. Nutrients redistributed now promised diminished hunger months hence. The first sowing day came with a wind that felt almost soft. Elin measured rows by the length of her forearm and palm combined, a dimension consistent across seasons, unerringly reproducible without tools. Peas went into shallow trenches, pressed with 2 fingers and covered loosely. Each seed received a silent accounting: calories invested, time horizon to return, risk profile, rot if too wet, desiccation if surprising dry spell. Thomas carried the small earthen bowl, Marta followed, pressing lightly to ensure soil contact without compacting. "Not too hard," Elin corrected once, guiding pressure. "Roots push easier through loose." The children nodded, a layering of motor memory onto conceptual knowledge. Other plantings waited: a few onion sets, precious carrot seed, fine as dust, a scattering of spinach to drink early spring light. Elin planted in staggered intervals, succession planning to distribute harvest and avoid single-point failure if a cold snap culled a cohort. Risk diversification embedded itself naturally into their routines. Farming was probabilistic negotiation with climate more than deterministic production. Jakob and Oscar joined to evaluate a footbridge upstream that winter ice had twisted askew. Without repair, water crossing meant waist-depth wading in flood runoff, an invitation to illness or lost hours detouring. The bridge, simple planks over twin-felled logs, had shifted so one support half floated, bobbing. They levered it with poles while another neighbour tamped stones at the upstream side. A shouted cadence-coordinated effort. Lift, wedge, settle. When the structure bore weight again, the men did not celebrate with exuberance. Only a shared glance acknowledging regained efficiency downstream. Time saved on every crossing translating to cumulative labour hours, recovered for all households. Jakob logged this indirectly. Less distance walked with wet hems meant fewer fevers. At home, Elin experimented with an improvement to heat retention for the coming cool nights. She shaped a low earthen bench against the wall beside the hearth, mixing subsoil with chopped straw and tamping it firm over a foundation of stones warmed during the day by residual fire. Mass holds heat, she explained to the children. We capture day, spend at night. It dried in slow phases. Each layer fired gently when embers ran low. Hairline cracks she smoothed with slip. Patient, iterative refinement. Moore's stories of a cousin who had once seen a Roman ruin with warm walls had seeded this concept. Inheritance of ideas sometimes bypassed direct feasibility until conditions aligned. Early shoots emerged, pale loops forcing arcs through crust, then unfolding into determined green. Marta named them ridiculously solemn titles: Keeper of Rose, Watcher of Morning Damp, which Thomas initially mocked and then adopted ironically before dropping the irony altogether. Personifying growth tethered their attention, increasing the likelihood they would notice pests or stress early, an emergent behaviour aiding plant health. Pests did come. Tiny leaf-edge nibbles signalled slugs. Morning patrols with small flat chips of board placed the evening before created collection sites. Flipping them revealed glistening intruders coiled in gelatinous repose. Thomas scraped them into a crock, an unpleasant task he performed with stoic focus. Why? He asked after a week. Because each one becomes hundreds, Elin answered. Because they will choose your supper before you can. He did not need more narrative. Rain settled into a pattern. Nights of fine mist saturating soil without violent runoff. Afternoons of scattered drizzle that erased noon dust before it fully formed. Optimal, yet such fortune stirred cautious suspicion. Jakob prepared drain rills regardless, shallow channels guiding potential deluge away from bed centres. We dig for rains that may not fall, so we are not digging frantically while they do, he told Thomas. Preemptive mitigation slotted into the boys' developing systems thinking. Barter season's first informal gathering formed at a flattened patch near the lane's bend. Families with slight overages brought them shyly. A dozen eggs, early layers, a bundle of nettle shoots, cord segments, patches of leather. Elin carried 2 of her better-rolled twine skeins and a small pouch of dried yarrow. She sought in return a handful of flax seeds, their own saved insufficient after rodent loss, and a narrow piece of tin to patch a small leak in their cooking pot rim. Negotiations were gentle but exacting. Tin now saves iron later, Jakob murmured, evaluating a strip's flexibility. They secured the trade after adding a future promise, assistance during hay cutting if Elin remained uninjured. Trust collateral expanded their exchange capacity, credit line established in social capital. An unsettling development emerged. A stranger observed the gathering from distance 2 successive market mornings, not approaching, only leaning on a sapling, eyes scanning stockpiles. On the 3rd day, Jakob walked deliberately to him, stopping well outside striking distance. If you watch, you declare interest. State it, he said evenly. The man swallowed. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, signs of prolonged caloric deficit. He carried no visible weapon beyond a belt knife. I look for work and a handful of anything, he said. Jacob weighed risk, introducing an unknown into network versus potential theft if turned away desperate. He proposed a bounded trial, half-day hauling stones from Field Edge for a bowl of pottage thickened with barley chaff, and a promise of nothing further unless mutual evaluation passed. The man agreed. Under watch, he worked steadily, not glancing toward unsecured goods. After, he ate with controlled hunger, not frenzy. They learned his name, Leaf. Move on after 2 days, Jakob instructed, then return if needed under same terms. Leaf nodded, conditions clear. Formalized conditional inclusion managed risk while adhering to a moral framework that refused unnecessary cruelty. Thomas witnessed the exchange, noting the structured negotiation of trust. Spring advanced into early summer. Daylight stretched, tasks elongated. The children now woke without shivering reluctance. Instead, dawn's bird call, a layered tapestry of thrush piping, wren chatter, corvid rasp, pulled them upright. They weeded in the long, low light, fingers pinching tiny invaders while roots shallow. Elin taught classification. Differentiate volunteer edible from weed competitor. This is lamb's quarter, she said, crushing a leaf to release its faint mineral smell. We eat it until other greens come strong. Resource categories blurred. Weed became food, waste became input. Nothing stood singular, all slotted into multifunctional context. One afternoon, a violent storm assembled with unnerving speed. The light went greenish. Wind collapsed downward rather than moving laterally. The pea trellis, a simple lattice of forked sticks and cords, swayed perilously. Jakob and Thomas ran stakes deeper while Elin directed Marta to gather loose items likely to become projectiles. The storm broke, sheets of rain, sudden gusts that snapped slender branches, hail pellets that pocked soft soil. They sheltered, counting seconds between lightning and thunder to gauge distance. The pea lattice held, though one corner leaned. Afterward they righted it, binding diagonal braces with cord. Resilience architecture retrofitted in response to stress, improved future performance without awaiting catastrophe. Hale shredded tender spinach leaves. Elin harvested damaged biomass for immediate cooking to salvage nutrition before rot established. We treat injury as timing shift, not total loss, she said. The concept of adaptive harvest windows integrated into the family's planning vocabulary. Jakob turned attention to firewood earlier than previous years now that mobility and ground conditions permitted efficient hauling. He targeted dead-standing wood first. Drier, easier to split, less fungal burden. He and Oscar coordinated to fell a medium spruce whose top had died, bark sloughing, a hazard if left to fall unpredictably near a path. They notched and back-cut with synchronized strokes calling status. The tree creaked, leaned, paused, a tension-laden moment, then surrendered with a crack and a downward rush. They trimmed branches, stacked them crosswise to encourage airflow, and transported trunk lengths via a drag sled Jakob had repaired, using the braided cord the children had made during the ice storm weeks prior. Prior investments in minor tools now yielded multiplicative efficiency. Stacking incorporated improved design. Jakob built a raised platform of parallel poles to keep the lowest course off damp ground. angled the stack to prevailing wind for drying, capped with overlapping bark slabs to shed rain. Marta placed thin spacers, slender sticks perpendicular, creating ventilation channels. Thomas measured approximate chord fractions, not exact but useful relative metrics, against last winter's consumption curves. 2 more like this before leaf fall, he projected. Jakob nodded, adjusting upward because of planned additional heat mass bench, which would slightly change burn pattern. Incorporating system modifications into forecasting advanced their planning maturity. Summer's heat arrived in a compressed burst, a week of daytime swelter that replaced layered garments with loosest linen and faint impatience. The earthen bench retained coolness now. Marta pressed her cheek to it mid-afternoon, laughing. "Winterstone becomes summer shade," she declared. Multi-season utility reinforced the bench's value beyond initial energy amortization calculations. With heat came insects. Mosquitoes rose in tremulous clouds near dusk from depressions still holding water. Bites risked infection. Scratched welts could fester. Elin burned a small smudge of damp sage and rotting pine cones upwind of the doorway to discourage their clustering. Subtle shifts in airflow patterns inside signalled when smoke infiltration threatened respiratory irritation. She adjusted dampers, a thin, flat stone temporarily blocking a portion of chimney gap, to moderate draw. This emergent ventilation control had evolved from winter smoke management. Competence transferred across seasonal domains. Leaf returned twice under previously defined terms. The second time he brought a small pouch of coarse salt as partial exchange. Tide receded south. I scraped pans, he explained. The salt, though impure and damp, glittered like a hoarded gem. Elin dried it on a shard near the hearth, then stored in a waxed cloth. Mineral procurement decoupled from typical trade routes provided redundancy. He becomes a vector of distant resources, Jacob mused after Leaf departed. Exposure to extended networks, within controlled relational frameworks, increased household optionality. Midsummer, a mild fever cluster moved through neighbouring families. Not a full-blown epidemic, no hemorrhage, no delirium, just persistent warmth, joint ache, lassitude. Elin responded by increasing fluid infusion production, willow bark for pain modulation, elderflower to encourage gentle sweating, mint to ease stomach. She rationed honey strictly for Moore's old jar now repurposed. Only those whose cough threatened lung integrity received the soothing mixture. Marta delivered bowls to doorways, leaving them on flat stones to reduce close contact. Distance and care can coexist, Elin told her. Behavioral hygiene protocols seeded in winter through ember-sharing caution, extended now into infection management. Thomas took on sharpening duties for edge tools after dull spade performance slowed bed maintenance. Jakob demonstrated stone angle once, then observed silently while Thomas found the rhythm. Circular passes, lifting at edge, water, sparingly applied, carrying off metal fines. Edge is compromise, Jakob said. Too thin chips, too thick waists force. Balance. Thomas examined burr formation with fingernail, eyes narrowing, an artisan's concentration budding. The principle of balanced optimization echoed earlier lessons about fire feeding, layering conceptual coherence across domains. Harvest approached by gradients. Early peas filled palms, green sweetness brief before starching. They ate handfuls fresh, an intentional morale expenditure, then shelled remainder for cooking. Elin set aside the most robust, undiseased pods to dry for seed. plump uniform peas representing genetic lines of resilience under that season's specific stressors. Seed saving moved from incidental afterthought to strategic pillar. Feedback loops shortened between observation and selection. Carrots, thinned, offered finger-sized roots crisp and sharp. Each removal granted space to neighbours, maximising final yield. Marta measured spacing with her smallest finger, delighting in the tactile rule. "My finger makes food," she announced. Autonomy in small agricultural calculations accelerated her competence maturation. Summer dryness struck unexpectedly after the earlier abundant rains. Surface crust cracked. Lower soil retained moisture from previous saturation, but shallow-rooted greens flagged midday. Elin mulched with pulled weeds, seed heads removed, forming a protective layer that moderated evaporation and suppressed new weed colonization. Mulch thickness calibrated by feel. Too thick and slugs found refuge. Too thin and moisture wick persisted. The children learned to lift a corner each morning, scanning for slug accumulation. Integrated pest management emerged organically. Late summer tasks overlapped with pre-winter staging. Flax pulling, what little they salvaged, bundling, drying in loose sheaves under partial shade to prevent bleaching, then retting in a shallow pond section for controlled microbial breakdown of pectins. The odour, stagnant vegetal decay, made Marta wrinkle her nose, yet she recorded fibre separation progress by testing small stems daily. When fibres slid free with minimal resistance, they lifted sheaves, drying them on elevated racks Jakob had crafted from coppiced hazel. Fibre preparation represented an investment in next year's clothing patch potential and cordage. Their resource portfolio diversified beyond immediate caloric inputs. The earthen bench, fully cured now, performed as designed, absorbing excess hearth heat when occasional rainy spells chilled evenings even in late summer, releasing slowly overnight. Jakob considered adding a flue channel beneath to direct more exhaust warmth through its mass come autumn. "We iterate," he told Thomas, sketching a crude side view in ash on a scrap of plank. Firebox, channel, bench mass, exit. Engineering literacy layered on survival context. As grain ripening time neared in surrounding larger plots owned by more affluent farmers, Jakob negotiated gleaning rights, a pre-arranged understanding that after main harvest, his family could collect fallen heads. Payment, 2 mornings assisting with scything. He returned those days sore-backed but satisfied. Gleaning later would add critical caloric diversity. Elin prepared by mending extra sacks, reinforcing bottom corners with cross-stitches to prevent burst under abrasive chaff weight. Autumn's first cool breath threaded one morning through the open shutter, smelling faintly of distant dry leaf. "We pivot," Elin said simply. Plant maintenance tasks wound down. Harvest processing accelerated, hanging braided alliums from rafters where smoke would deter rot. Slicing apples, bartered from a tree-rich neighbour, into thin discs for drying on lattice trays above the bench. Turning roots in a shallow pit lined with straw to insulate against early frost. Each action nested inside a time horizon, days, weeks, months. They trialled a new insulation approach along the north interior wall, suspended a secondary fabric layer, stitched from multiple linen fragments, creating an air gap. Marta helped tack it, measuring even spacing with a short stick cut precisely for the purpose. The microcavity trapped still air, adding R-value with minimal material expenditure. That night, seated near the wall, they detected reduced draft sensation by subjective skin thermal receptors, Elin recorded in her mind to replicate on the west wall before deeper cold. Wood stacks now numbered 3 main rows plus a shorter partial: spruce, birch, mixed limbwood, each labelled in their shared vocabulary by texture and burn behaviour. Thomas proposed rotating use each week to prevent premature depletion of one category. Jakob approved, adding the nuance of saving denser pieces for the coldest months to leverage sustained ember generation. Resource levelling strategies matured into codified rotational schedules. Seed inventory took final tally. Peas sufficient to expand planting next spring by 1 additional shallow row. Carrot seed moderate. Flax marginal. Emergent self-sown dill unexpectedly abundant. Fragrance promise for preserved roots. Elin stored seeds in small parchment packets, inkless marks indicating types by notch patterns cut in edges, insurance against label fading. Redundancy in labelling method guarded against future confusion if moisture smudged any written charcoal. Leaf appeared once more as leaves began yellowing at margins, offering a strip of cured fish in trade for a share of future gleaned grain. The fish, oily and dense, concentrated calories. Elin accepted, careful to cut a portion to consume immediately, and a portion to render into a small jar of fat for winter use in medicinal salves. Multi-stage utilization of a single trade item exemplified increasing systemic efficiency. As nights cooled, they tested the bench's heat retention with a controlled burn, loaded modestly with birch splits, allowed flame to establish, then raked coals into a shallow channel under the bench's base cut earlier for this experiment. After 2 hours, Jakob sealed the channel with a flat stone to slow airflow. At pre-dawn, the bench radiated faint warmth perceptible to a bare palm. We capture waste previously lost, he assessed. Efficiency increments, even small, compounded over months into stackable comfort margins. Thomas, now taller by a head than at winter's start, lifted heavier splits without strain. His voice carried new timbre when calling Marta to tasks. Authority transfer occurred gently. Elin monitored to correct any emergent dominant skew not grounded in collaborative ethos. Leadership is taking cold shift without complaint, she reminded when he deferred nash-scraping chore. He accepted the correction, performing extra thorough cleaning that evening. Marta learned to braid 3-strand garlic with even tension. Dexterity milestone. She presented the finished loop to Elin, who hung it where smoke curled. "Your pattern holds," Elin said. Compliments remained precise, reinforcing technique quality rather than diffuse praise. The first frost-silvered grass won dawn, its delicate crystalline tracery ephemeral under rising sun. They walked the periphery, noting which low spots retained frost longest, data for spring planting microclimate mapping. "This hollow lags," Jakob pointed. "Avoid early peas there next year." The continuous environmental feedback loop persisted. A full seasonal cycle had furnished them with refined parametric knowledge. Inside, they rekindled the morning fire with practiced fluidity that now contained layers of inherited, iterated, and innovated method. The ember bank responded. Flame climbed with minimal smoke. The earthen bench accepted heat, storing quiet promise for evening. Jakob looked across at Elin, then at the children. No formal declaration marked the transition. Preparedness itself was ceremony enough. Wood, food, insulation, skill, memory, all stocks balanced within adaptable ranges. Loss, more, integrated not as raw wound, but as a node in their network of practice. Her methods diffused into their movements. The cottage, improved within its humble limits, stood ready to host another winter's negotiations. They had stretched the prior season's crucible into a broader arc, one that encompassed not merely survival under stress, but incremental, compounding refinement of how they interfaced with land, weather, resource, and each other. The coming cold would still press, threaten, extract cost, but it would meet a system tuned, never invulnerable, never complacent, always iterating. And when that cold's first true breath descended again, settling silence between trees, the family would answer not with fear thick on tongue, but with deliberate motions rehearsed yet never wrote, carrying forward embers, designs, and a resilient grammar of making do that now belonged to them more fully than ever.